What does it mean to be an American? For some, one simply is, without questioning of loyalty or suspicion. But for others who don't resemble a stereotypical white American, proving oneself worthy of inclusion, proving oneself American, is a perpetual battle. For Japanese Americans, sustained success and inclusion into American society was possible only after their release from the World War II era internment camps. These camps provided a testing ground where loyal Japanese Americans would be separated from disloyal ones, and made the face of Japanese American representation in the U.S. The internment camps were the turning point that changed Japanese Americans from being seen as enemy aliens to being portrayed as being uniformly more successful compared to other minorities, a model minority. The Perry expedition in 1853 opened the gates to a Japanese influx into America. Whites responded to this yellow peril with anti-Asian leagues and legislation, spearheading the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924 that barred Japanese immigrants already in the U.S. from becoming U.S. citizens and prohibited all further Japanese immigration to the U.S. This sharp cutoff of further immigration to America was a turning point that created distinct generations of ethnic Japanese, which each had different stances on assimilation. The Issei, first-generation Japanese immigrants, felt no need to assimilate. They spoke little English, and their success was tied to the close Japanese communities they formed in America. Another deterrent to assimilation for Issei was that they were considered enemy aliens, people ineligible to gain citizenship. In contrast, their children, the Nisei, pushed for assimilation, believing it would gain them respect, equality, and acceptance. They formed the Japanese American Citizens League, or JACL, a patriotic group that wanted inclusion into white society by proving that they were American. But when Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japanese forces on December 7, 1941, even the most patriotic Japanese American was subjected to war hysteria, racism, and discrimination.
And they said, we are at war, Jap planes were bombing Pearl Harbor. Well, the minute they said Jap planes, you realize you're an American, but you realize you're of Japanese ancestry. It was just the look of hatred in their, it's hostility. You could sense it,
Japanese Americans, led by the JACL, responded to these hostilities with attempts to distance themselves from Japan and create an image of an upstanding, non-threatening, American-loving minority for themselves.
It was in February that the FBI came back again to interrogate my dad. And he said, as long as I'm in America, I'm loyal to America. Well, they took him anyway.
In the eyes of the American government, there was no difference between Japanese Americans at home and the Japanese they were fighting abroad. Every Japanese face could be a potential spy, a fifth-column saboteur that would overrun America. Thus, on the grounds of national safety, Executive Order 9066 was signed on February 19, 1942 by Franklin Roosevelt, ordering the evacuation of all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast to internment camps inland. With only 48 hours' notice, families rushed onto buses destined for the isolated camps, threatened with jail if they did not cooperate. The internment camps housed over 120,000 people of Japanese descent, of which 2/3 were American citizens, from 1942 until 1946. The 10 camps formed by the War Relocation Authority were distributed in isolated areas, consisting of roughly constructed barracks enclosed by barbed wire. Conditions were harsh and desolate. Even while incarcerated by America for an ostensible lack of loyalty, Japanese Americans faced intense and direct questioning about it, dividing community members between protesting against the country that deprived them of rights and trying to prove they were American through unconditional patriotism. In September 1943, a loyalty questionnaire meant to discern which Nisei were loyal to America was instituted by the War Department and War Relocation Authority. Controversy among incarcerees stemmed from questions 27 and 28, which asked, "Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered?" And Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese Emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization? Those that replied no to both questions, seeing them as patronizing and hypocritical, were sent to Tule Lake, an internment camp turned segregation camp for those considered disloyal to the U.S. These no-nos would face stigma for their perceived disloyalty from the larger Japanese American community. The majority of Japanese Americans answered with yes, yes to questions 27 and 28, in hopes that professing their loyalty would prove that they were true Americans. Some formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a highly decorated group consisting of all Japanese Americans. This regiment, deployed in 1944, formed the blueprint for what good Japanese Americans as a model minority should be: patriotic, invincible, and self-sacrificing. While the 442nd fought abroad to destroy Nazi concentration camps, Nisei back home were fighting for their release from the internment camps. After the 1945 Supreme Court ruling ex parte Mitsuye Endo in favor of internees' civil rights, the War Relocation Authority began to relocate Japanese Americans to communities outside the camps, closing the last camp by April 1946. During the years of unfair incarceration, hate, and hysteria, there was never an actual instance of espionage or disloyalty among any Japanese American. Immediately after the internment camps, economic necessity and traumatic memories of incarceration drastically transformed the lives of Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans lost an estimated $400 million due to the loss of homes, jobs, and businesses. The Issei, as prominent business owners in their communities, were rendered financially weak and physically frail due to their old age. Upon their release, they were no longer the leaders of the Japanese American community. This turning point opened a vacuum for younger leaders that would support assimilation, the Nisei. They were able to flourish economically after the war without the ethnic community, and instead moved to white suburban communities across the country for jobs and houses during the white flight of the 1950s. Yet Nisei were scarred by their memories of incarceration, which they saw as a result of not being seen as loyal Americans. They attempted to embody American ideals in order to prevent the experience from reoccurring. These post-war changes in lifestyle and culture allowed Japanese Americans to assimilate into white America. Japanese Americans who replied no to the loyalty questionnaire faced estrangement from friends and family alongside the racism that the entire community faced. After the war in 1946, the National Japanese American Citizens League Board formally condemned all no-nos, draft resistors, and those that fled back to Japan. This compounded the stigma no-nos faced, and they became even more alienated from Japanese Americans as a whole. Assimilation and the creation of a monolithic identity first seen in the camps combined to transform Japanese Americans from unwanted foreigners into a model minority, stereotyped as being uniformly more successful compared to other minorities. The 442nd, created from the most loyal of those who took the loyalty questionnaire, became the face of Japanese American representation. The less assimilatory members like the Issei and no-nos were distanced from the majority of ethnic Japanese in the United States, creating a monolithic ideal of what a Japanese American should be. No-nos suffered financially and academically after the war, lacking the upward mobility other, more assimilated Japanese Americans possessed. Moreover, economic dependence on white communities meant that Japanese Americans were dependent on the approval of their white superiors to earn a living, valorizing themselves as an obedient and high-achieving labor force. Whites saw this as a positive trait, juxtaposing Japanese Americans with other, more undesirable minorities. Initiatives like Asian Americans Against Affirmative Action used the image of the successful Asian American to undermine the success and mobility of Black and Latino Americans, thereby defending the white majority in universities. Today, the question of loyalty to white America is continually asked of Asian Americans as a model minority, just as the loyalty questionnaire forced Japanese Americans to prove themselves worthy of the title American. Assimilation and the creation of the model minority myth allowed Japanese Americans to be included into white American society. This stereotype was only possible after the internment camps, where those willing to assimilate into white society could be separated from those who would not or could not. The internment camps were the turning point that changed Japanese Americans from being seen as enemy aliens to being stereotyped as a model minority.